Today we got some more actual history about Sam Bass and his gang of train robbers. We'll be reading from this book, Life and Adventures of Sam Bass, the notorious Union Pacific and Texas train robber. This book was published all the way back in 1878 by the Dallas Commercial Steam Press. This was a newspaper that published this book right after Sam Bass's crime spree came to an end. Today we'll hear about Sam Bass's plunge into a life of crime when he began robbing stagecoaches and then when he robbed the Union Pacific train that was transporting gold from the San Francisco Mint back in 1877. While in the Black Hills, Bass made the acquaintance of Nixon and Jack Davis, and probably of all the men who assisted in the Union Pacific train robbery, but according to his own statement, only Jack Davis and Nixon were engaged with him in stage robbing. There were 7 of these stagecoach robberies in all, and some money was realized from them, but how much is not known. It is apparent that but a short time elapsed between the stage robberies and the capture of the railroad train at Big Spring, Nebraska. This was one of the most daring and successful train robberies ever committed. Collins formed the plan of the robbery, though it is believed that Jack Davis first suggested it. He had come from San Francisco and was familiar with the fact that large sums of gold were constantly passing over the route. The names of the gang, 6 in number, have all been ascertained since, Bass himself testifying to the correctness of the list in his dying moments. They were Joel Collins, formerly from Dallas County, Texas, Sam Bass from Denton County, Texas, Jack Davis from San Francisco, Bill Heffridge, who went from San Antonio with Collins and Bass, James Berry from Mexico, Missouri, and Nixon, of whose history but little is known. A more daring and desperate band of outlaws was never gotten together in this country. Collins acted as leader of the band, and it has been charged that he spent 3 or 4 weeks previous to the robbery at Oglala, Nebraska, gambling and associating with desperate men from whom he organized this gang. It has also been said that he had a cattle ranch near Big Spring Station, and thus became acquainted with the habits of the station men, the operations of the train, and the surroundings of the office, but this has been denied. The time selected for the robbery was Tuesday night, the 19th of September, 1877. As Big Spring was only a water station, the plan evidently was to capture the few men employed about the station and keep them under guard until after the train was robbed. At the appointed hour, the bandits boldly rode down towards the station, hitched their horses conveniently near, and at once proceeded to business. With a small flourish of revolvers and the well-known command, "Throw up your arms!" the station agent and assistant were soon made secure. As train time, 10 o'clock, drew near, the bright rays of the headlight were seen falling upon the distant track. Then came the long sound of the whistle. The rushing train checked its speed, and in a moment more stood still upon the track. It was but the work of an instant for one of the gang to mount the engine, command the engineer and the fireman to throw up their hands, and there hold them helpless under the muzzle of a cocked revolver. But even before this had been accomplished, 2 of his confederates had boarded the express car and were ransacking its contents. They soon found a large quantity of gold in one of the safes, but the other could not be opened. It was in vain that they ordered the messenger to open it. He assured them that he had no key, that it was a time lock and could only be locked or opened at each end of the route. Jack Davis cursed and raved, beat him over the head, thrust his revolver into his mouth, knocking out one of his teeth and lacerating the flesh, and threatened to blow the top of his head right off if he didn't open it. But Bass said he reckoned the messenger was telling the truth, and that they had better give it up. After going through the coaches and robbing the terrified passengers, the bandits slowly backed away, keeping their arms presented until they were lost to view in the darkness. A number of shots were fired during the transaction, and a few wounds were inflicted, but no one was killed. The gold taken from the express car amounted to the sum of $60,000, no small weight for the robbers to handle under the circumstances. It consisted entirely of $20 gold pieces of the coinage of 1877, a fact which was afterwards of material assistance in ferreting out the perpetrators of the crime. Shortly after the robbery, the gang divided the money and separated, going 2 together by different routes. Bass, Davis, and Nixon for a time vanished from view. Of the others we shall speak in the succeeding chapters. The Big Spring robbery created intense excitement among railroad officials and caused a general sensation throughout the country. The large amount of money secured was looked upon as a temptation, which would soon lead to another like attempt. This, in connection with the heavy shipments of gold over the line, would be likely to excite the cupidity of every bandit in the West. At the same time, the long stretch of road through waste and desert regions, with here and there a lonely station, made it very difficult to afford adequate protection. It was determined, therefore, to capture the robbers at any cost and hazards. Large rewards were at once offered by the state authorities of Nebraska and by the railroad companies. This brought forward detectives from almost every quarter. Telegrams were sent to all officers along railroad lines and to sheriffs and officers in command of U.S. troops. At first it was not wholly known who the robbers were or whence they came, but it so chanced that among the passengers on the plundered train was a young man named Andy Riley, a resident of Omaha, Nebraska. During the attack upon the train, Riley stood upon the platform and received a wound in the hand from one of the flying bullets. He was also robbed along with the rest of the passengers. He had traveled with Joel Collins on the way to Deadwood and knew him well. He had also seen and conversed with him only a few days before, while on a visit to Oglala. Great was his surprise, therefore, when the robbers came through the train to find Joel Collins among them. Immediately upon his return to Omaha, he notified the officials of the fact, and Collins' name and description of his person were accordingly telegraphed in all directions. It was shortly learned also that after leaving the railroad, the robbers crossed the Platte River in Nebraska, and were next heard of on Young's Ranch on the Republican River in Kansas. This was on the 23rd of September, the next Saturday after the robbery. Intelligence of this fact having reached Sheriff Bardsley of Ellis County, Kansas, he at once started from Hays City on the Kansas Pacific Road with a squad of 10 cavalrymen and a detective from Denver, and made his headquarters at Buffalo Station on the Kansas Pacific. This is 60 miles west of Hays City, in the center of a wild and dreary waste. Nearby is a large ravine in which the sheriff and his posse camped. While there, about 9 o'clock in the morning of the 26th, Joel Collins, the chief of the train robbers, and a single adherent rode up to the lonely station. The following account we take from a Western daily of the 28th. When first seen, they were riding from the north, coming boldly over a high ridge of open prairie. They led between them a pony heavily laden with something which, while it was not bulky, seemed to tax the strength of the pony to carry it. The men were dusty and travel-stained. They appeared to be and might have been taken for 2 Texas cowboys, out on a hunt for cattle or on their way to join a herd. Had they rode straight across the track and continued their journey without stopping, no suspicion would have been aroused, but they were led instinctively to their death. They rode their jaded horses to the shady side of the principal building of the station, and one of the 2 dismounted, leaving his partner in charge of the horses and the pack pony. The man left in charge of the horses said that they were Texas cattlemen on their way home, and inquired the way to Fort Larned. The dismounted man walked up to the station agent and inquired the way to Thompson's store. The building was pointed out to him, but as he stood conversing, he took out his handkerchief, which revealed a letter in his pocket, upon which was plainly visible the superscription, Joel Collins. This was the name of the leader of the Union Pacific train robbers, and the brands upon their horses assured the station agent that these were the men wanted by the sheriff and his soldiers encamped a few hundred yards away. Sheriff Bardsley was notified at once, and he came to the station and examined the horses and made other satisfactory observances. He conversed with the robber chief for some time, and asked many questions which were freely answered. They walked together to the station and took a drink, and conversed upon various unconsequential subjects. Collins made no effort to conceal his real name. He had no suspicion whatever that the telegraph had given his name and description at that little station in the middle of the Buffalo Plains. Bardsley then left his prey and started back to the camp of the soldiers, who were under the command of Lieutenant Allen, and ordered them to saddle up and follow him, and he would bring back the Texans. In the meantime, the 2 horsemen, with their heavily burdened pony, had started out on the open plains southward. Sheriff Bardsley and his posse started out in pursuit. When Collins and his companions saw the sheriff and his blue-coated posse of cavalry appear on their trail, they manifested no excitement. They did not even attempt to run. On the contrary, they rode on leisurely on the Texas Trail until Sheriff Bardsley rode up and halted them. Even then, they gave no sign of trepidation or excitement. Collins looked at Bardsley with the coolest effrontery and demanded his business. Said Sheriff Bardsley, "I have a description of some train robbers which answers well to your appearance. I want you and your partner to return with me to the station. You need fear nothing if you are innocent, and if you are the man I want, then I am $10,000 better off. Please come back to the station with me, gentlemen." "You are mistaken in your men, gentlemen," said Collins laughingly, "but of course there is no use to object. We will go back and have the mistake explained. We are Texas boys going home, that's all." They then turned their tired horses back towards the station. As they returned, they exchanged a few brief words, which were undistinguishable even by the nearest trooper. They rode a few hundred yards over the level plain towards a solitary station, when suddenly the leader, Joel Collins, broke the silence. Turning to his companion, he said, "Pard, if we are going to die, we might as well die game." Then he drew his revolver. His partner followed his example, but before either could fire, the troops had fired a volley into them, and they fell from their horses, riddled with bullets. The robbers died instantly and were taken to the station for burial, but were afterwards taken to Ellis Station, where an inquest was held upon the bodies. The body of Collins was identified by a dozen of his old Texas acquaintances, but for a long time the body of his accomplice could not be identified. It was at first believed to be that of Sam Bass himself, and was so telegraphed over the country and published in the papers. Finally, Anna Langs appeared in the depot, where the bodies were lying, and stated under oath that she recognized the body as being that of William Cotts, formerly of Pottsville, Pennsylvania, but more recently of San Antonio, Texas, and that his father resided in Pottsville. He was a light-complexioned man about 30 years of age, light hair and sandy beard, about 5 feet 7 inches high, and weighed 135 pounds. Whether Anna had any real knowledge of the man, or whether she thought so because she thought so, or whether the true name of Heffridge was Cotts, is difficult to say. But there is no doubt now that the man who fell with Joel Collins under a shower of bullets was the member of the gang known as Bill Heffridge. At the time of his death, Collins was described as being dark-complexioned, with black hair and beard, about 5 feet 11 inches high, weighed 150 pounds, and was supposed to be 28 years old. He was also said to have been affable, of pleasing address, intelligent, and very handsome. Upon his body a small piece of paper was found, upon which was written a poetical effusion by a lady, and dedicated to Joel Collins, but the richest discovery was made upon the pony. When the tired little animal was stripped of the blanket which covered the pack saddle, an old pair of pantaloons was found underneath. The ends of the legs had been tied together. Then they were filled with gold and thrown across the saddle. When the glittering metal was turned out upon the ground and counted, it was found that the amount was no less than $25,000. It was all of the mintage of 1877, and in $20 pieces. This fact, taken in connection with the other circumstances, furnished the strongest evidence that the lucky Bardsley had struck the right man. Railroad officials were in high glee, and congratulations were exchanged all along the line. But in a few days, serious doubts began to creep into many minds, and it was gravely feared that the deadly rifle had struck down an innocent man. A leading law firm at Topeka, Kansas was retained to investigate the circumstances attending the bloody tragedy. It was alleged in Collins' defense that he had obtained a large sum of money from the drove of cattle which had been disposed of the previous year, that he had written to his father that he had obtained 25 cents per pound for them, and would soon start home with the money. It was also stated that he had amassed a considerable fortune in the cattle business with his brother near San Antonio, and that this precluded all temptation to commit robbery. In addition to this, it was said that there was unquestionable evidence as to the time that Collins started for home, and of his movements which tended to show that he could not have been in the vicinity of Big Spring at the time of the robbery. Collins's conduct at the moment of his death was accounted for on the supposition that he believed himself in the hands of a gang of outlaws who intended to rob and murder him, and that he was determined to sell his life as dearly as possible. About this time, an old Texan came out with a short newspaper article defending Collins for many of the charges which had been made against him, and stating it to be the belief of those who had long known young Collins and his parents that he was not the guilty man. But a few days later, the dying statement of one of his captured Confederates forever set at rest all doubt in regard to the matter. Since then, the deathbed statement of Bass himself has been added to the proof. As Joel Collins, so far as known, participated in but one noted crime, few events in his life have been preserved on record. He was born in Dallas County, Texas, where his parents still reside, his father being a farmer of some means, and a man who has long enjoyed the respect and sympathy of his neighbors. In 1868, young Collins left home and went to the southwest part of the state, where he had a brother in the cattle business. From 1868 to 1870, he was in the employ of Allen and Poole, the great cattlemen of the coast, and stood well as a young man. In 1871, he took a herd of 1,000 cattle to Kansas for Bennett and Choate of North Texas. In 1872, he took up a large herd for P.T. Adams, Joel receiving one half of the profits. In 1873, he did the same thing and on the same favorable terms for James Reed. In 1874, he bought a drove from Bennett and Eckard, partly on time, and was still induced, if not forced, to ship them to Chicago at a heavy loss. This he did against his will in order to meet the deferred payments, when the cattle were poor and the market was down. This is the statement made by his friends, while others give a different version of the matter. In 1875, he kept a saloon in San Antonio for a few months. The house is said to have been a disreputable one. In 1876, as we have already seen, he took his last drove north in company with Bass. In the spring of 1877, he is said to have opened a provision store at Potato Gulch, 35 miles from Deadwood. His friends claim that he remained there until he started for Texas, but there is much reason to doubt whether it was known to them what he was doing during his last stay in the North. His letters were not always intended to give the exact situation of affairs. It has been charged that he killed several men during his life, but this is probably an exaggeration, as there is no authentic account of more than one such act. In 1869, he killed a Mexican in Victoria County, but surrendered himself, was tried, and then acquitted. As is well known, it is very difficult for an American to murder a Mexican. It is a principle with jurists that such acts are always for self-defense. Before closing this chapter, we pause for a moment to note the fatal chain of apparently trivial circumstances which so quickly tightened around the unfortunate Collins. Never was the perpetrator of a great crime stricken down by a more unerring blow of retribution at the very moment when escape seemed well nigh assured. It must be admitted that he showed a singular lack of shrewdness, first in not thoroughly disguising himself when he boarded the train, and secondly in not giving a wide berth to all telegraph stations. But still, had he rode through Buffalo Station without stopping, he would have passed unnoticed, or had he left the dust and sweat upon his face, and allowed his handkerchief to remain in his pocket, or had the telltale envelope not clung to it, he might soon have been beyond the reach of detectives and soldiers. But the unseen hand of fate had marked him for her own, and at that very hour, his bold attempts to defend himself against a whole troop of soldiers may be called bravery, but it was the extreme of folly. In a country like this, where the jails are weak and the law weaker than the jails, where the whole criminal jurisprudence seems to be run for the protection of criminals rather than for the public, it would have been better to submit quietly and await a better opportunity. There is reason, however, to believe that this reckless leader of the bandits feared Judge Lynch and preferred to die game. The capture and death of Collins and Heffridge occurred on September 26th, but no further clue to the remaining robbers was obtained until about the 8th or 9th of October, when suspicion was aroused in Mexico, Missouri, by a large sale of gold which was made there. While at Boonville on October 11th, Colonel A.B. Gardner, General Superintendent of the MK&T Railway, received the following telegram. Mexico, Missouri, October 11th. James Berry, an old resident of Callaway County, is one of the Union Pacific train robbers. He was at Williamsburg on Monday night. He is 6 feet high, weighs about 190 pounds, is 40 years old, has a red face, yellowish red hair, mustache and goatee just recently shaved, round, full face, blue eyes, and freckly hands. We will pay $500 for his arrest and 10% of the money recovered. He had about $9,000. Think he is making for Texas. Have all the crossings closely watched. He has a pacing bay horse and a new saddle. On the same day, the Moberly Monitor published the following. A man by the name of Jim Berry of Callaway County has just returned from the Black Hills to Mexico, Missouri. Suspicion has been directed to him of complicity in the Union Pacific robbery by a financial transaction in which he was engaged immediately on his return. The morning after his arrival in Mexico, he visited the banks at the hour of opening and sold gold to the amount of $9,000. Berry remained in Mexico all day Friday and until Sunday evening. He was princely extravagant with his money. Meeting an old mining acquaintance, he gave him $250. He delighted a clothier by purchasing a fine suit of clothing without higgling at the price, and bought a $300 bill of groceries which were sent to his family in Callaway. Saturday evening he took his departure, and Monday morning the bankers received news that the gold he had exchanged and which they had shipped to St. Louis had been identified as part of the treasure captured by the Union Pacific robbers. The next day, Tuesday, a corps of detectives from St. Louis and Chicago arrived at Mexico, and with the Audrain County Sheriff at their head, started in pursuit of Berry. After a long, rough ride, the vicinity of his house was reached, and the party so disposed as to completely surround it. They now felt sure of their game and the rich reward that awaited his capture, but they were doomed to disappointment. Narrowing the circle and gradually closing in, a rush was finally made for the house. They encountered no opposition where they had calculated upon a fierce resistance, and upon entering they found that the bird had flown. A thorough search of the premises revealed no trace of the daring robber, and though the whole country had been scoured by different parties, his trail had not been struck up to yesterday. There is not a particle of doubt that Berry was one of the robbers, and his capture is only a question of time. This prophecy was shortly fulfilled, as the following account published in the Mexico Ledger on October 15th will show. It appears that last Saturday night, as our sheriff was eating supper, about 6:30 o'clock, he received a message that a man was in town after the suit of clothes that Berry had left at Bloom's. The man's name was Bose Casey. He lived near Berry's. He told Bloom that Berry had told him that he could have the clothes if he would pay the balance of $30 that was due on them. This was the way he had his job fixed up. Glasscock ran right down to Cabrick's Hall and hid behind the corner and saw Casey come out. This was 7:30. Glasscock followed him to Wallace and McCamey's livery stable. Just as Glasscock got near the stable, he met Jay Carter and told him to come along. Carter, Glasscock, and Casey all got to the stable at the same time. Casey paid for his horse feed and started to get on his horse. Sheriff Glasscock then took Casey by the collar, presented a pistol to his head, and told him that he would shoot him if he moved. Casey did not move. Glasscock ordered 2 more horses saddled. They then tied Casey on his horse. The sheriff and Carter then got on their horses and the cavalcade moved off, Glasscock leading Casey's horse. They went down to the branch near Tom Smith's in South Mexico, and as they thought no one would get wind of them there, they stopped. Glasscock then went and got John Coons, Bob Steele, and a young man named Moore. All got horses and double-barreled shotguns, which were then loaded with buckshot. They then told Casey that they would have to know where Berry was. He said he had not seen him since he, Berry, had told him that he could have the clothes, which was about a week before. The men started out towards Casey's house and met Jeff Jones about 12 o'clock Saturday night. At about 3 o'clock they got to James Armstrong's. Sheriff Glasscock told him what they had done, and he wanted Armstrong to go with them to show them where Casey lived, as he was afraid that Casey would fool them. Armstrong said he did not know where Casey lived, and so he would not go. We don't know whether Armstrong knew or not. It was then 3 o'clock Sunday morning. The posse then all got around Casey, put their guns to his heart, and told him that if he led them into any trap, or did not take them at once to his house, they would shoot him down in a minute. He said he would take them to his house if it would do them any good. When they got within about a half-mile of Casey's house, they took Casey off, tied him up, and left Bob Steele to guard him. Then Glasscock placed 2 men north of the house and stable, Moore and himself going to the south and west side, and as the open timber was there, they thought that he might be over in that. They did not alarm Casey's house at all. It was not quite daylight yet. They all secreted themselves in thickets, as mentioned above, to await the results. Glasscock then told his men, "Boys, if you see him, halt him. If he shows fight, shoot him down. If he runs, shoot him in the legs. Catch him at all hazards." In about half an hour, Glasscock heard a horse about a half-mile off, as he thought. Moore and Glasscock then crept toward the noise, went 300 yards down the branch, came to a fence, and saw fresh horse tracks. Glasscock got over the fence and got into a thicket, heard the horse snort about 50 yards off in the brush. Glasscock took off his hat and crept up 20 yards closer. Then he raised up and saw Barry unhitching his horse from a tree. Barry then led his horse aslant toward Glasscock, as Barry now says, to lead him to water. Glasscock cocked both barrels of his gun, ran out about 20 yards within only about 20 feet of Barry, and demanded him to halt. Barry started to run. Glasscock shot, but aimed too high, which caused the charge to go over Barry's head. He shot again, and 7 buckshot lodged in Barry's left leg below the knee. Barry fell to the ground. When Glasscock got to him, he was trying to get to his pistol, but he could not get it out before Glasscock was on him, and snatched it away from him. He then asked Glasscock to shoot him, that he did not want to live. Glasscock told him no, that he did not want to kill him, he wanted him to have justice. Just then Moore came up. After Moore came up, Glasscock called for the rest of the posse, when they all gathered around Barry. Glasscock then searched him and found in his belt 5 $500 packages, and in his pocketbook was found $340. He had a gold watch and chain, 1 dressing coat, 3 overcoats, and comfort. He had doubtless slept there within 10 feet of his horse. They took him to Casey's house when Mrs. Casey got breakfast for the men, while a messenger was sent to Williamsburg for medical assistance. Immediately after breakfast, Sheriff Glasscock and John Carter started for Barry's house to look for the balance of the money. Upon arriving there, Glasscock inquired of Mrs. Barry the whereabouts of her husband. She replied that she did not know, as she had not seen him for 4 or 5 days, and thought he had left the country. Glasscock then showed her the watch and chain, when one of the children said, "Oh, I thought that was Papa's." Glasscock then told her that he had got her husband. When she asked if he had been taken alive and receiving an affirmative reply, she said, "I never thought he would be taken alive. He said a good many times he would never be taken alive." At this they all began to cry, the wife, 1 little boy, and 5 little girls. It was a very distressing scene. Glasscock searched the house but found no money. The house was well provisioned for the winter, hams without number, sacks of flour and coffee, kegs of molasses, etc. After Glasscock left Casey's, about 40 of Barry's friends came around and made threats about taking him away, but they did not make any attempt at all. It all ended in talk. At first it was not thought that Barry's wounds were serious, but gangrene set in, and on the night of the 18th, his sufferings became very great. It was apparent that he had not long to live, but he maintained a determined and bravado spirit to the last. As the deep silence of night settled down upon all without, he lay in his gloomy cell, alternately writhing in paroxysms of pain, or coolly talking to the officers who remained with him to the last, anxious to secure a dying confession. This wish was partially gratified, as he stated in his dying moments that he was one of the parties who committed the Big Springs robbery, that Collins had planned the robbery, and that the names of the rest of the gang were correct, as given by the express company. He said that they had all traveled together 200 miles, and then separated in squads of 2, that his partner came to Mexico with him, and then went on to Chicago. This partner must have been Nixon, as it is well known that it was not Davis. After much suffering, Barry died at 1 o'clock in the morning. He left a wife and 6 children. He is said to have been very respectably connected in Galloway County. Thus it is seen that in less than a month, 3 of the Big Spring robbers had been consigned to bloody graves. They had lost their booty and paid the penalty of their crimes with their lives. There is little reason to doubt Barry's statement that Nixon went to Chicago. From that city, he probably went to Canada, as Henry Underwood stated to the officers at Omaha on December 30th that Nixon was a Canadian and that he was then in Canada. Bass also made the same statement at Round Rock. According to the dying statement of Davis, the whole gang traveled together 200 miles and then separated. Where this separation occurred is not known, though it was probably somewhere near the Republican River in Kansas, where the gang was seen 4 days after the robbery. In the separation, Bass and Davis chose to go together. Like the ill-fated Collins, they also started for Texas, but by a different route. It is said that they visited Sidney, Nebraska after the robbery and then left the city suddenly, but this is doubtful as it would have been attended by very great danger. Be that as it may, it is certain that they purchased a one-horse hack, loaded their gold in it, and turned their course southward just as soon as circumstances would permit. Months after this, when Bass was safe in Denton, while lounging the day away in camp, he told the boys that soon after they set out in the buggy, they fell in with a company of soldiers and detectives. They at once assured them that they too were detectives hot in pursuit of the bold bandits who had robbed the Union Pacific train, and that they hoped to come up with them, for there would be a big thing in the capture. This threw the officers off their guard, and the two were allowed to join the squad. They continued with them for 4 days while $20,000 of ill-gotten gold clanked under their seats as the old hack rattled over the road. The officers with whom they laughed and joked all day long would have given thousands of dollars to have known this secret, but it remained concealed, and finally the wily robbers bade them goodbye and drove gaily away. The next heard of them was in Cook County, where Bass passed under the name of Samuel Bushen. Here they separated, Bass going to his old home in Denton, and Davis departing for the gay metropolis of the South. Here he seems to have lived a fast life, spending his money freely and enjoying himself as passion led or vice dictated. But it was not long before he suspected that detectives were shadowing his track. This led to his return to Texas, where he met Bass, and the two proceeded to Fort Worth. Here, Jim Murphy exchanged $4,000 of the stolen gold for greenbacks. Bass divided the money with his old partner, and that night Davis took the train, and now a score or more of detectives would give much to know where he is. Early in December, Sam Bass, Henry Underwood, and Frank Jackson went to San Antonio. Thither they were followed by Sheriff Everhart of Sherman, Tom Guerin, a rather noted character of Denton, and Tooney Waits, a detective who had come from the north to identify the parties connected with the Big Springs robbery. Waits believed that Underwood was connected with that affair, and declared his readiness to swear that he was Tom Nixon. Sheriff Everhart also acted on the same belief, and went to San Antonio for the purpose of arresting Underwood for Nixon. The name of Bass does not figure conspicuously in the controversy which afterwards sprung up in regard to this matter. Tom Guerin says that he had a warrant in his pocket for the arrest of Underwood on another charge, and that was his object in pursuing him. He says that he knew that Underwood could not be the man who was known in the robbery as Nixon, because Underwood slept at Jim Hall's ranch in Denton County on the 16th or 17th of September, and could not therefore have been in Nebraska on the 15th. There can be no doubt that harmonious action and shrewd management would have resulted in the arrest of all of the party, but the officers did not act in unison. Additionally, 1 or 2 prostitutes were let into the secret, which helped to mix matters much. In the meantime, Captain Lee Hall was telegraphed to hurry up with the Rangers, but Bass was not the man to be captured by any such hesitating methods, and suddenly he and his associates vanished. Bass and his party soon returned again to Denton, where they remained some time, as will be seen further on. A freebooter with $10,000 in ready cash at his command is apt to prove a great demoralizer to any community not steeled in moral integrity. As he passes here and there among his friends and neighbors, with a pocket full of gold pieces which he deals out with a free hand, buying without pricing and loaning without hesitation, he soon becomes such a convenience and desideratum that men of easy morals and scant conscience do not care to see him driven out of the country or lugged off to jail. This proved true of Bass's stay in Denton County. His gold made him many friends. He was always so kind and obliging that they were ready to do almost anything for him. No greater curse ever befell that county than his stolen gold. It brought reproach to the whole people, ruin to individuals, and sorrow to many homes. It was an evil which the thousands of good people who live there still deeply deplore, an evil, too, which it will require years to eradicate from the young and susceptible mind. So that's it for this episode. This is episode 2 in my series on the life and adventures of Sam Bass. His gang, led by Joel Collins in this case, pulled off what is still to this day the largest robbery of a Union Pacific train. But within about a month, 3 of the 6 robbers were dead. It appears that Nixon, the Canadian, may have successfully escaped, and Jack Davis is said to have fled to South America. He tried to convince Bass to come with him, but Bass stayed near Denton, Texas, and he started a new gang of train robbers. We'll hear about his next adventures in Texas in the next episode of this series. This channel is called Unworthy History because we talk about actual history that is now deemed unworthy to show on history channels on TV. Those channels unfortunately don't play much actual history anymore. So stay tuned to this channel for more history about people whose shoes we are unworthy to stand in. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe. And we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.